Welcome to the Xylem Group on Fire Talk. I'm here with Linda Steer, expert in policy governance, board member for co-ops, and seminar leader. What else do I need to say about you, Linda?
That's good.
That's good. And today we're going to be talking about board transparency. And when we mean board, we're talking about nonprofit boards of directors, boards of trustees. And nowadays you hear a lot of directors who are both fearful of being transparent in what the board is doing, but also wanting to be in touch with their constituents. They want people to know that they're doing good works, but they are concerned about what is important with regard to board transparency. Linda, you must have some experience with this. What are people talking about when they talk about board transparency?
Well, to begin with, I always find a great place to start, right, with regards to transparency is getting clear on what people do think that it is, because I think there's a notion about transparency, and then what are we actually really talking about with regards to transparency? So and that's where I think from what people, there is, as you say, the fear oftentimes of, I know that I've served on boards that you don't want everybody to know exactly what everybody's opinion is about something in the course of a discussion. We just want to let them know the final decision, because otherwise it becomes, interested parties now micromanaging the discussion, which can inhibit the board in freely being able to say whatever there is to say before coming up with a resolution or a decision about something. And then, there is oftentimes those who have an interest in what's going on, or particularly somebody who might not like what's going on with an organization is going to be very attuned to, I need to know everything that you're doing and everything that's going on. And I want to know what you know so I can assess your decisions about things, right? So I think a helpful place to start is actually going back to, well, what's transparency and why even have transparency? We're thinking about a board essentially is the representative voice for owners, or with nonprofit organization membership, or, those who have a vested interest in the mission of that organization being fulfilled, that as representatives, you would think logically there would need to be some level of clear understanding about what that group of people are doing, and a clear understanding of what people actually would want them to be fulfilling on, right? So transparency makes sense, like a piece of glass if you're looking through something, but what does that actually look like in reality at the board level? So I often always love to go back to Marion, what your dictionary of choice as to what does it mean to be transparent. So I looked that up for today's discussion. And transparent is free from pretense or deceit, easily detected or seen through, readily understood, or characterized by visibility or accessibility of information, especially concerning business practices. That was an interesting one to me. Another is honest, open, and non-secretive. So if you look at the role of a board in representing the interests of somebody, a group larger than themselves, and then you look at the sense of really having something that's free from pretense, you want to have some very clear discussions or information passed in which people can readily understand why a decision was made or where you were coming from. I think creates a frame perhaps for a different way of looking at what actions would we take, or what information would we share, or what people might actually be interested in.
But Linda, you have this situation where boards, I think when I talk to board members, they want to be transparent, but you did say people need to know about the decisions. Well, of course, those are the things that are published in the minutes, but maybe the discussion is not something that they want to present. But isn't the discussion the part that people are interested in? Because when the discussion is over and the decision is made, there's no place to kind of get your oar in to understand what the motivation is behind that. So At what point do people talk about the process of making a decision? And how important is that for the constituents to know? Some boards operate very much in the public realm, and we see school boards do that, municipal councils do that, but they have times when they do go into executive session or operate in camera, in other words, behind closed doors. But it's at those times that the constituents are most suspicious, because that's when the Machiavellian things are happening. So how do you balance? And you need to be able to do this with integrity. And I believe board members really want to operate with integrity. But how do you do that, Linda? How do you actually let people know that your processes are legitimate, your decisions are reasonable, and that you are taking into account the things the constituents would want you to think about and debate?
That's an excellent inquiry, Robert. Because when I think about it from a non-board member standpoint, it always seemed, in many times with government and nonprofit organizations, it seems like this black box, right? That suddenly information goes in and some decision comes out, and they say it's a good decision, but am I finding myself in it? There's no guidance for that. And so one thing, when I'm looking at the dilemma of what people might be concerned about, because if you can see it in the public arena right now, that as soon as an individual who's part of a decision-making group comes out and does a newspaper interview or says, here's my thoughts about it, suddenly that person gets branded with something, and either they get voted out or something happens with regards to that. So one way that I look at it, which is why this one particular aspect of transparency was very intriguing to me, that it said characterized by visibility or accessibility of information, especially concerning business practices. So when I look at that, I'm thinking, what a board could do, especially if it might be an executive, there's certain topics that that really are confidential, personnel policies and so forth.
Of course.
But I could see really creating a dialogue with people about, here's the nature of how we go about making decisions. So people can here's the process we use. And then I could imagine in the reporting of the decision is to also say, here are the various perspectives and angles that we considered, right? So not necessarily tapping it into the micro detail of this person said X and this person said Y, and then X said this to Y, but to say, okay, here's the various challenges, here's the various perspectives that came into play. Here are the challenges that we dealt with, being able to weigh out of a decision. And then here's why, based on whatever factors or criteria, that this is the decision that got made. So and I don't know exactly to what degree, the board might want to convey that to people, but that people would really get a sense of, oh, here's the scope. Like I might even find myself in one aspect of opinion that got brought to the table. And now I can see why it made sense as to why that actually had an impact on the final decision or didn't make it into the final decision. So this sense of being readily understood, that there's, you can actually see through the process of how the board was thinking, but in a way that's constructive and forwards the unity of the partnership, right, of the representation, versus really wanting people to go in there and start picking through and second guessing what happened.
Sherry has said in the minutes rather than he said, she said, recording. How about a table of pros and cons? The question, though, is, and I'm going to ask this of Sherry and of Linda, is who's going to write that? And the reason I'm saying that is because this is happening after the fact. So what's going on here is you're reporting. This is not unlike having a newspaper reporter or a PR person. And since it's going to be the board that's doing this, in a sense, this is a public relations effort. Are we talking about reporting or are we talking about spin? And how do you distinguish it? And who is accountable for making sure that the reporting is accurate and that it does follow some of the principles of the Fifth Estate. In other words, the person who is reporting really does tell people what they want to hear rather than what the board would want to say about what fiction went behind that decision. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yes, yes, I totally do, because I think we operate in a culture pretty much where everybody's out for protecting themselves. So if a board's dealing with a controversial issue, that it becomes what spin or how can we do this in a way that people aren't going to be upset with us.
Yes.
So I think it's a matter of really building the culture of here's the kind of relationship that we want to have with you, and be upfront about that. Actually say that and be upfront about it. And I have seen groups that particularly, I see this happening, but I can see this might be a regular process that might be useful. But on certain times when it's, that it's public, it's a publicly charged issue. But I've seen groups at the end of the discussion say, okay, what do we, as the group, as the board, being accountable for that communication out, how do we now want to communicate this out? Like, what are in just what we're beginning to talk about here, what are the pros and cons? What was the scope of what we dealt with? How did we come to the decision? How do we want to, what are the salient points that we want to communicate? Now, that might be delegated to somebody who speaks for the board or what gets written up, but that the board is really the final say. It's a board communication going out.
So is this something that comes back to the board like the minutes for approval at the next meeting? What you say about the minutes, not just the minutes themselves?
It's not. It wouldn't be What's interesting? There's the minutes about what happened. I don't know. I haven't really thought about that. Right, as far as there are the recording of the official minutes of the meeting. There could, I think, transparency actually demands something more than posting minutes. I think the transparency really calls for a kind of dialogue between the representative body, the board, and the constituents to say, okay, here are the cut and dry minutes about what happened, but let's frame it. There's a framing to it. There's a way of understanding with a clear intent of the constituents understanding the process and understanding why we came to what we came for, that everyone's included. And when they're not, I think the board would want to know that of what hadn't gotten considered that people are interested in.
John Bruce has commented, directors can ask that the record show, and that gets included in some kind of a communication. What I'm hearing is that it's all very well to hold meetings in camera, but you need to report more than just the actions that the board has commanded, which they have the power to do, but they also need to communicate something about why those decisions were made and what the context is. So boards, I'm hearing, have a responsibility beyond just carrying out the duties of the board and making decisions. They also have to communicate that as well. We're running out of time. Can I ask you if you have anything more you want to add to that, or if my winding up is lacking something?
That's good. I do want to comment. Sherry put into the chat, don't you think the pro cons adequately describes the arguments from both sides of an issue? And I actually think that it could. I think one piece, there's pros, cons, and then there's decisions. There might be something about the criteria perhaps that the board used, or here's why the decision went where it went, right? There's something that actually links those two, but I agree with what Sherry wrote.
And Sherry is saying, I like that. Pros and cons work if you have pros and cons, but very often when a board is noodling something around, when they're working through something in a kind of a workshop environment, you come up with a creative new idea. So it's not so much pros and cons, it's sort of a process during which something is born, something new perhaps, which I've seen happen around the board table.
Well, I love how, here's how we noodled this. Here's how we noodled this. So.
And Sherry says, I think we may have been talking about contentious issues in one context. And John Bruce says, South African jurist Donald King said that being transparent doesn't mean being naked. Thank you, John.
Excellent
I
point.
think we're going to wind up
Excellent point.
not being naked. Thank you, Linda Steer, for joining me. And
You're welcome.
we will put this together as best we can, and it will appear on xylemgroup.com, I hope. Thank you very much for watching and listening.